Welcome back to part 2 of Puffins Galore, the Power of Working Together Better interview series, where I, Christina Griffiths, and where Clare Huby, one of the key management team on the project, will be delving more into communication and decision making and how they were key to helping everyone work together better. So going on to thinking about how you all got together, your meetings and the regular rituals that you needed. So how often did you get together as individuals and or groups?
Well, the core team got together fairly regularly, either via something like we were using Zoom actually, but we use Zoom quite a lot. But we also, during different points of the project, when there was a lot of activity going on, what we would do is make space. So, for example, while we had artists in the studio, we would potentially get all of us, the 4 core management team members, because then we could cover the warehouse looking after everybody and do our meetings. So there were meetings held in various places, but largely it was electronic because that was the easiest way to do it. We had some face-to-face meetings with our funding partners, but again, because the nature of when we were working, I mean, it was kind of when we first sort of got into this was sort of 2021 when we actually really started working together. So there was still a need and a desire by people not to spend too much time in lots of crowded situations. So all of that electronic meeting came to the fore, and that was a massive learning curve, and just getting comfortable with it, how to use it, because you lose a lot of stuff about being in the same room and having those conversations and things like that, but then you also gain some things provided they're well managed meetings. So it had its ups and downs, but generally worked pretty well.
So I think you were saying that, or you alluded to the fact that using technology like this was a new thing for you guys.
Even as a group of 4 people, we had really varying experience of having used technology.
So what key things would you say were important to making sure you had a well-run meeting?
Well, first of all, there was making sure that people were comfortable with the basic technology, and sometimes that was just a case of spending 10 minutes, even with our kind of management team, kind of going, this is how it's going to work. The other is using the same meeting protocols that we would use in a normal meeting, making sure we had, even if it was a loose agenda, having an agenda, making sure that we didn't get bogged down in kind of the minutiae, rather saying, actually, we need to, this is complex, these 2 people need to go off and have a proper discussion about that and investigate. And a decision within the meeting about whether those people who went off to the side were then able to make a final decision, or whether their research had to come back to the meeting. So it was same as normal meeting protocols, obviously including cats, babies, and people ringing on the doorbell delivering parcels.
I think we all remember that. COVID times, and probably even for most of us now, still we've got all of those factors, haven't we, going on? Interesting times. It's interesting to think back to actually all the impact that COVID had and how it fast-tracked us for using Zoom. Or I have to say, I've been using Zoom since, well, not Zoom, I've been using technologies like Zoom since 2001. More obviously it was audio conference back then, but it's interesting how the majorities have now been sort of goaded on now to be using this sort of virtual communication, and how it can be a bit of a shock, and how we have to kind of adapt ourselves. But that's right, it's important to remember what we're mimicking, and to make sure that we do some of the basics, like have an agenda, even if it's just a loose one. I think that's right. Especially if you don't want to waste time or get lost in lots of rambling conversations, which can happen face to face, of course. We can all recognise that.
But sending out that summary at the end of what actions have been agreed and who's supposed to be doing it, which I think is always essential, because you have those conversations, there needs to be some kind of, it doesn't need to be a full set of minutes. It might just be, we agreed that this would happen and who was going to do it, because that allowed people to say if they couldn't. So
and that obviously will make sure that you have a good, successful meeting, whether it's face to face or virtual, won't it? But I don't think everybody realizes to do that, so it's good that you highlight that. So that's great. And the other thing I was going to ask you was, How do you ensure that everyone feels connected? Because that's one of the biggest challenges is working virtually, is the fact that you could feel a bit isolated and you may not feel the importance of the project or feel the personal connections you have with everybody. You don't see them very often, or you may not even feel like the project you're working with is prioritized, amongst your other priorities. So how did you overcome that?
Well, within the core team, we all made an effort to just occasionally, kind of almost socially, just check in with everybody else within the team, especially if somebody had noticed at a meeting that one member of the team was maybe appearing to be a bit disengaged or not quite comfortable with something that they maybe wouldn't raise at the meeting, would be just to check back in with them. And that was often kind of my responsibility, was to sort of just go to one of the members of the team and say, you looked a bit down, or you didn't look as though you were fully on the job. Is everything okay? Is there anything we can do? And, if there were particular circumstances, whether it be personal or kind of other work type commitments, was kind of helping them find a way of kind of making sure that they could do everything they needed to do. And if they couldn't, because again, this kind of project, because of its timescales and because of its time limits, is that you've got to have it done. So there was a kind of it was much better to have a heads up of where there might potentially be an issue and have something ready in place. So it was checking in with people, with the Puffin pals and the artists and the sponsors, was just regular communication via WhatsApp. So even if they weren't doing anything, so say, for example, it was the Puffin pals before the Puffins went out, we'd recruited them all and we'd be dropping them a message just saying, hi, it's only a couple of weeks to go before your puffin goes out. We'll be sending you more information about your location and things, and just generally making people feel as though they were part of everything, even when they weren't actually having to do anything.
So Puffin pal was somebody who was associated with a particular puffin, and that they were going to keep an eye on it. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was part of our insurance policy that we had to have the puffins checked once a week for kind of structural integrity and to make sure that there was nothing that was going to cause injury or anything, if they'd been damaged. And we spent ages working out how were we going to do it. It was going to cost us a lot to get somebody to drive around every week, and 9 times out of 10 they were all going to be fine. So we actually advertised publicly and said, would anybody be a puffin pal? So all these people got allocated their very own puffin and fell deeply in love with them.
Also amazing, as you can see. Displayed behind you.
Some of them behind me.
They're fantastic. I can see why people fell in love with them.
So
going back to the fact you had a good portion of your people working with you were technical, did you have to take into that account in how you worked with them? It was different from perhaps the other people in your groups?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think all of the groups had some quite had different approaches to things and different kind of needs and different ways of the things that they needed to understand were different. The things that were a priority to them were different. And I think that's often the same one in my work. Generally, I do a lot of working between business and artists. And I think so for the artists, it was about getting the artwork right, and all the rest of it, and thinking about, for a lot of them, it was a huge learning curve, learning to paint on curved surfaces, paint on a big 3D model and things like that. So we had to support them in a particular way. Whereas when we were working with, for example, the web designers, and trying to get their technical need for things like images at the right resolutions, things within certain timescales, map locations. We were using what 3 words to find the locations for the maps, and also a lot of stuff that was kind of beyond our technical understanding. So we're working with web designers who we know very well and kind of speak to us in words of 1 syllable where necessary, but as long as we were clear with them what we needed, so they could kind of turn that into something else. It was different, and it was finding a way of communicating a need in a way that spoke to the priorities of those people, if that
Right.
makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So it's
Yeah.
about communication style to some
Yeah.
extent. So, like from your point of view, you wanted your technical people to keep it simple, as you
Yeah.
said in a word of one syllable or more. You want to keep it simple, and from their point of view, you found that really what they wanted was the detail and the
Yeah.
technical aspect from you. They didn't necessarily want anything
Yeah.
else. That
They didn't need the whys and wherefores necessarily.
No.
What they needed was the precise information.
Yeah. Okay. So that's interesting, isn't it, to see that?
Yeah.
And I imagine that's very different from the other groups of people you're working with as well. So
Yeah.
when you're working cross function like that, so I imagine the artists were not interested in precise information or
No.
no.
No, they didn't. They wanted to know that their puffin was where they needed it to be, and I guess the precision information that we had to get across was things like about the use of the sorry, speaking of cats, I'm having a visitation. It was about the use of the varnish. We have a very specific varnish that we use that has to have a very specific actual kind of administration. And we sent out very clear instructions, and of course people coming back going, oh well, we'd say you've got to do it both coats within a certain period, and people would come back and go, well, I'm away for the weekend, it'll be all right if I do it on Monday, won't it? And we're kind of like, no, it won't. The reason we've sent you the instructions we've sent you are
Yeah.
So where we needed people to respond to specific information, it was quite hard to make sure that they sort of got it and sort of realized how important it was.
And the two different and the different groups needed to hear it in different styles of communication. That's what I'm hearing from you. So talking of difference, so what happens when you had difficult or contentious news to share or of any type? How did you handle that? Did you, because obviously you were mainly working virtually at that point.
Well, because of the nature of the project, because it kind of has because we'd got to know people on the project, and so we knew what people wanted and what their interests were. We would try and make sure we had the right person within our management team communicating with them. That was one of the really important things, that it was the right person doing the communicating.
And then did you do that virtually, or did you do it face to face, or how did you handle that?
Depended very much on it. So for example, it was one of our sponsors who were obviously kind of business people who we would by no means their priority. One of the things they love about these projects is they put their sponsorship in and we give them all this beautiful stuff and they don't always have to do loads. So some of them respond much better to just a WhatsApp or an email or some other form of electronic communication, but personal, not kind of just via the groups, but a kind of direct message. Others respond much better to a phone call, because if you leave them anything in writing, it just won't get read.
Sure.
Others, again, where we had a relationship with somebody's PA, so that if there was anything essential or contentious, that we would kind of speak to their PA and say, look, please, can you make sure that they contact us, or can you let us know when they're available, so that where it was important, we made sure they got the message through directly.
So you were trying to, as much as you could, I was bearing in mind how much communicating we're doing, you were trying to keep it as personal and individual as possible. So if you could have spoken to them face to face individually, you would have done that.
Yes.
Which is actually what the research shows is the best way forward to do it. But obviously life isn't always like that. And so you found different ways of reaching the different types of people, and as you just explained. But it sounds like you handled most contentious information through somebody else. But the person who had the connection was the one that delivered it, if at all possible.
So, and there are, and we also found as we've worked together, the core team, 3 out of the 4 of us have worked together on this kind of project previously, and we all have strengths. For example, we have one of my colleagues is the absolute sponsorship king. He's the one who goes out and can get people to hand over their money for sponsorship. I have another colleague who's great at working with the artists, has the right touch and all the rest of it. I unfortunately get all the jobs where I have to tell people nasty things because I can be open and honest but be firm. So it's so there is a kind of split that happens a bit like that, but also it depended very much on what the information was that we needed to get across and what result we needed to get.
Right, so you split it. So it's down to strengths then. So
yeah,
understanding what people's strengths were. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a lovely way of dividing up a team, of course.
Yeah.
So you're not treading on each other's feet, and you can divide the tasks in that way. Okay, that's really interesting to do. So how did you, amongst you, agree the standards for outputs? How was that done? Because there were 4 key core members of the team.
Yeah.
And obviously now you've explained that one person was in charge of the artists, so you must have all had different ideas. So how did that go?
Yeah, benign dictatorship. It works. The level was that myself and one of my colleagues were actually kind of the company directors, and we'd kind of instigated the project. So there was a hierarchy in the sense of, had it ever come to it, that my colleague and I would have had the final say in anything. But actually most of what we did was sort of through discussion and recognizing each other's specialities and things like that. And I think a mutual respect, which enabled there to be a situation where a discussion could be had, and not everybody would necessarily agree that it was the way to go forward, but that people would understand that, and we'd talk through the pros and cons. So I think I'd be fair to say that there were no decisions made that anybody was absolutely against, if you see what I mean, because even if they didn't, it wasn't the decision they would have made had it been their decision to make, they could understand the logic behind the decision we did make.
What level of decision was made by you as a core team, and how much did you trust the people beneath you?
Well, so for example, if we took, so we had an overarching thing about how we recruited the artists. Then the artists had the option then of coming in a set period of time, either to the warehouse to decorate their puffin, or to come and take it away to take to their studio, and then it had to be returned by a certain date. So we, as a group, we made those decisions, but then what happened was one member of the team was then responsible for kind of programming that whole thing, and again would be that core point of contact, and had a kind of free hand to make decisions about how that worked.
So going back to the recruitment, for example, were you involved in the recruitment, or were you able to let one of your managers just handle that? The recruitment
of the artists. Again, that was a bit of a joint thing. What happens is that we put an advert out for the artists, they all submit, and then we had a shortlisting where we were in fact all involved in the shortlisting. And then what happens is that the sponsors choose the design that they want. So in a way, once we've got past the shortlist, the recruitment of which artist actually gets to do their design is actually in a way down to the sponsor. It's the design.
You didn't have to be involved with that. Yeah.
No, it's not quite the same.
So to what extent were you involved in the day-to-day? Because you were one of the core team members. So, were you able to let go? Because that's one of the biggest challenges, isn't it?
It is, and particularly with the kind of role that I have in what I do, is that my job is to know exactly what's going on everywhere and be prepared to drop in if I'm needed. So I kind of have to be able to do everything, and I think that's where having a team of people that you can trust. So we were working with a new social media supplier, and in the early days, there's a kind of tentativeness because you're trying to get them on message. So we'd recruited the right person, and as time went on, you have to take that step back. So it was about taking kind of steps back from it. So by the end of the project, they were actually driving the social media because they really knew what they were doing. So they were coming after us going, I want information on this. This is what I'm going to do. I need this information from you.
So that's one of your ways of telling that you've managed to take a step back, the fact that they're driving you rather than you driving them.
Yeah. And also that what we can tell we've got the message across properly when what they're not coming up with ideas where we go, no, that's not what we want to do.
So that's one of the that's understanding that the wrong message allows you to trust them, so that you can take a step back. What's the first thing you do to take a step back? What's your first thing that you first way that you trial something out to make sure that you can take a step back? Because we all know, everybody knows you've got to take a step back, and everybody also knows if you take a step back too quickly, it can be a bit of a disaster. So what's your tip there?
I think what I would normally do is I'd find an element of the work that I wanted somebody to do. So I've got a way of doing things, because with these projects you often have to it's a do it yourself a lot of the time. And so I have ways of doing things, and one of the things I'm very aware of is that just because it works doesn't mean it's the best way. So it's getting people to a point where there might be an element of the work that they're doing, say for example programming something for us, that what we do is we say, this is what we need, and I'll put a deadline on it which is earlier than we absolutely need it, and kind of give them the brief, get them to go away and work on it, or give them the task, and just kind of stay out of it, and then allow them to come back and to have a conversation around what they've done. And sometimes they'll come back and it's like, wow, that's amazing. And sometimes you kind of think, actually, this person just needs a little bit more guidance at this stage. So you kind of go through it. So it's about working out what you're 80% sure you can trust somebody with. And trusting them with it, but with a little bit of a safety gap, it depends a bit on what it is, because sometimes you can kind of fudge stuff if it's not 100% how you would do it. But also there's always a learning curve to be had, because I know over the years I've had lots of experiences where I've kind of done that. Somebody's come back with something, I've gone, oh god, that's a brilliant way of doing it. I've saved, and then I've taken that on to be the way that I would do it for the future. So there's a kind of reciprocal learning that happens as well when you start to take a step back and not try and make somebody a clone of what you do.
I hope you enjoyed part 2, where Clare Huby delved deeper into the importance of good communication and decision making. It's worth highlighting that this project started out mainly as a virtual project during the COVID outbreak, and it evolved into a more physical project later on. Most of the people involved in the project, like so many at the time, were not used to working virtually. In our interview with Clare, she talked about how the management team took a tailored approach to communication. Communication was adapted to the needs of each stakeholder group. They considered factors such as the COVID-19 restrictions and people's individual preferences. Communication was regular and maintained through weekly Zoom meetings, individual check-ins, and face-to-face meetings where necessary. The one-to-one check-ins fostered personal connections and helped managers identify potential concerns early on. Stakeholder groups were kept informed about project progress and their specific contributions, and this meant that there was greater alignment and preparedness. Communication was timely, and this minimises surprises and ensured that everybody was on the same page. Different managers connected effectively with different stakeholders, and this fostered better rapport and engagement. Tasks were assigned based on individual strengths, and this helped with productivity. Decisions were made collaboratively with the final approval from the accountable managers. Finally, mutual respect prevailed when there were disagreements, and these disagreements were resolved through logical explanations. And this was possible due to the trust and the goodwill that was built up in the relationships. I look forward to you joining me in part 3, where we talk about the importance of team climate, Clare's key lessons learned, and useful tips to help others work together better.